afternoon. I'm very excited to be with you today. When I learned that Google did author talks was a number of years ago when we had actually first written our parenting book, but it was from a fairly small press, and it was definitely written for a sort of, limited churchy audience, and I didn't think that it would be particularly interesting. But when I came to Lauren and said, I have this book called Good Christian Sex, certainly people would be interested in that. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a funny topic to be writing and talking about as someone who is working in churches. This is not a particularly academic text. As one of the great things about pastoral ministry is that I get to be a generalist. So I get to write, and I get to read, and I get to hear people's stories, and I get to be a part of the life of a community. And all of my education always has been interdisciplinary, and so allows me to know about a lot of different things. So we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the biblical stories that have shaped the way that American Christians talk about sexuality. But I am not someone who can get into an argument with you about the proper pronunciation or meaning about the Greek or Hebrew. You are not going to ever see my Greek grades from that year in seminary. Another thing that I don't ever really like, or I don't address in the book at any rate, is some of the biblical texts that are known in the church as clobber passages. Those are the sort of 7 that people like to trot out to bash queer folks over the head with. And I don't really address those. They've been looked at by scholars on all kinds of sides of the issue. And so I don't really talk about those, because they're not, well, anyway. But I don't want to parse what has already been discussed. But I did think that there was a place for this book. So just to draw nice, broad strokes, in the Christian tradition, the part of the Christian tradition that I grew up in, I'm a preacher's kid, actually, who has now written a book about sex. My parents are super proud of me. And the church that I grew up in was progressive in some ways, but also largely silent about issues around sexuality, about the experiences of sexuality. We had some Christian sex ed that we were made to go to as junior high students. Ours was led, at least in part, by my father, which was not even remotely awkward, and didn't shape me at all. But we learned a lot about sort of the creation story and God's good gift of sexuality, and then basically sort of, use birth control. And that was sort of the end of that discussion. And so for me personally, a lot of at least growing up, a lot of the narratives that I had about what, healthy sexuality looked like came from sophomore year health class taught by the JV basketball coach and 90210 or Dawson's Creek, or, so you're 16, you should probably be sleeping with whatever boyfriend you have. The other sort of strand of American Christianity that really started talking a lot about sex in the 90s when I was a teenager continued an emphasis that had begun in the 80s when when abstinence-only education became a part of something that could get funding in schools. It actually started during the Reagan administration, but sort of ramped up as part of the Clinton welfare reform in '96, but then and then again, certainly when President Bush introduced the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, and so they talked a lot about that. And that part of Christianity really emphasized abstinence-only education, and that teenagers, young adults, everybody should be fully chaste, that was the word, chastity, until they were married. And anything outside of marriage was problematic and wrong. And that narrative came to really dominate what people understood was the Christian understanding of what, holy, good sex was. And in our world, and particularly in the mainline Protestant congregations that we grew up in, I had no idea that was going on. By the time I read the sort of seminal text of that movement, I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Josh Harris. I was in grad school and I read it and I was like, well, that ship has sailed. I'm sort of done with that. So, but I was also actually really angry about it, and this, because it's sort of a terrible book, but also because the author, who was at that point just a 21-year-old, kid himself, wrote this tome that sort of suggested that not just sex, but really any sort of feeling of pleasure or desire or of romantic relationship outside of something that was leading directly to marriage and in fact in the moment after marriage was very wrong. He has there's one book that he talks about. He has the first book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and then he has the sequel is When He Met His Wife and when they started courting. They did courting, not dating, which is holier. At one point, he's sitting in a hammock. They're like head to foot, so they're sitting next to each other in a hammock, and they're not even really touching at all. And but he looks and he starts to admire her legs. And he then is overcome by a feeling of his own sinfulness. And he has to picture Jesus bleeding on the cross in order to right his mind and get his mind out of the gutter again. This is like a month before their wedding. So that book had a huge effect on.
Is he going to mess up his wedding at all?
No. They're going to just totally set that baggage aside right away. But not only for them, but for really a generation of sort of American Christians growing up in a certain part of the church. His book and others then like it, along with True Love Waits and some of these other movements, really affected the way that we talk about sexuality. As someone who identifies as a Christian and had some really wonderful experiences before I was married, I was frustrated by the sense that somehow, our sexuality was something that could be turned on and off. There are a whole lot of disciplines who tell you that's a terrible idea. But also the fact that healthy sexuality was somehow wholly distinct from what it meant to be a faithful person. So this book has sort of come out of this cultural moment and my personal experience, but also a real desire to just talk about what it feels like to fall in love and meet somebody that you want to touch and be touched by. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church, which, like many other churches, we were often very silent on sort of issues of what healthy sexuality looked like. We definitely have it don't ask, don't tell, you'll probably figure it out. If you really are in a crisis, you can come and talk to your pastor and maybe they will give you good advice, maybe not. But the issue that we really focused on is LGBTQ inclusion around ordination, around marriage. That has been the dominant conversation and fight. And it's been ugly and horrible. And while some denominations are on the better side of it, the Methodist Church is still really mired in it. And so part of my hope then too in addressing these topics is to help offer an entry point. I don't think all people are the same and all people believe all the same things, but I do think that it can be helpful to folks to give them a way to identify with other people. So I kind of wanted to unpack the experience of falling in love or of seeking pleasure or of following your desires. And so that's so the book takes up questions of sexuality, but also relationships and love. And then the final sort of impetus, I now work in a local congregation, but I used to work at the University of Chicago, and so I worked with a lot of college students and graduate students, and certainly with some of the Title IX stuff and just being on a college campus, you can't ignore the very open wounds of rape culture that's really all around. The questions about what's the nature of consent and how do we get it and how do we ask for it and what, there's lots of hand-wringing about hookup culture, and I really wanted to not do hand-wringing. I don't know, I went to college and I met some people. But at the same time, I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day who's a college chaplain. And she and her husband, who's on the faculty at the college where she works also, the students came to them and wanted the couple to do like a panel discussion on how you date. Like, they know how to get wasted and like sleep with somebody they don't really know, but they have no idea how to kind of build intimacy. Aside from any moral, questions we might have about what it means that you have to knock yourself out in order to pursue something, it's very hard to have enjoyable, pleasurable experiences if you can't communicate at all with your partner. So there's probably some need to like teach communication skills to people. So that's sort of my interest for younger readers. So that's kind of the framework in which this book came out of. And so I wanted to then share with you, since the introduction to the book went up on a Facebook First Reads program, I've started getting all kinds of comments. I know I've really made it because I've finally started getting like trolled. But all these folks who are convinced that I am a heretic and a sinner and I am leading people down the primrose path all the way into hell. And they like to pull out Bible verses to tell me why I'm wrong, for suggesting that sexuality is a part of who we are and that our bodies are not separate from our minds or our spirits, but that we're all sort of, just humans with bodies and souls and all these things. And that focusing on sexual ethics, which is my interest, as opposed to sort of sexual morality, is a problem. So they proof text about all the things. You have to shun fornication, and don't you know your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and all these things. And so I try to engage the Bible in a slight, it's certainly not new, but a different way. I don't want to proof text. The great Christian ethicist, she just retired, I believe, from Yale. I believe she just retired. She was at Yale. Margaret Farley she wrote this wonderful book called Just Love, and it's sort of a Christian sexual ethics. And it's firmly within the tradition of Christian ethics, but she challenges enough. She's not a nun, but she's taken orders, so she's a Catholic holy woman. I can't think of what the word I'm looking for is, but she's a woman religious. There you go. And she got in trouble with the Vatican for this book, right? So it's great. It's good when it's been knocked by the Vatican. But it's very much in keeping with the tradition. But she has this great line that's basically like, you shouldn't proof text the Bible about anything, but you really shouldn't proof text the Bible about sexuality. Proof texting, of course, means just pulling things out of context and sort of saying, well, here it is. Here's the coherent, list of rules that we've got right here. Because that's really just not how the Bible is written. It was written over an extended period of time by multiple authors. Parts of it are and have always been understood as allegorical. Parts of them are histories intentionally offered from different perspectives. Parts of them are letters written to very particular communities at different moments in time. And so she sort of says, we have to be really careful when we think about how we're going to look at biblical texts, particularly around issues of sexuality, since they're so fraught. So she's really wonderful, and if you ever feel like you have, some weeks to spend on Christian sexual ethics, Just Love is where to get started. But if you don't have that much time, you can read my book, which is far easier to understand, I think. So the Bible certainly does offer points where things seem to be, well, let's just say the Bible offers a whole bunch of, everything. My biblical hermeneutic, that's the churchy word for interpreting the Bible, is, there is a lot of stuff in there. And sometimes, and part of my job then as a pastor is to interpret the Bible for people, like people in my community. And again, I try not to, I'm not an academic insofar as I don't parse, I don't read the original language most of the time. But I want to think about what this story meant for people in the past and what it means for us today. So one example that I want to start with is actually from the book of Joshua. And this is sort of an example of how Joshua is, he's the one who succeeds Moses, right? So Moses has led the people out of slavery in Egypt, and they've gone through the wilderness. But Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land because he's made some errors of his own. And so Joshua takes over and becomes the new leader of the people. And the Lord, the Lord says, I brought you to the promised land, and you should go into it, and it will be yours. Here it is. I've given it to you. The problem when Joshua and the people arrive is that the land is already inhabited. And in the book of Joshua, then the Lord says, well, no, it's yours, so go ahead and wipe everybody out, especially make sure you get the women and children, take them out. So this is hugely problematic, right? The Lord is commanding genocide. That is not cool. So this came up in the lectionary, which is one of the ways of ordering our preaching schedule. And so I had it, and I'm like, well, God, what am I going to do with this? Because this is terrible. But I pull out the commentaries and the academic works, and this is not a historical moment, right? This genocide didn't actually happen. The people were, a small and struggling population. And as they told these stories over time about how they had come to live in the land, they needed to feel as though, they were powerful and they were safe and they were, and so this story becomes, God commanded us to come in, and we, by the power of God, wiped everybody out, and now it's ours. So I think that's an example. Obviously, that one's not about sexuality, but an example of how biblical texts really have to be kind of looked at in their context. And some of them, you read at face value, and you're like, no, I get that. That makes sense. But some of them, the distance is a little bit farther. So the one I want to start with is actually about masturbation, because, you got to dive right in. When I first wrote the draft of this book, this first chapter on self-love didn't exist, but it became increasingly clear that I needed to have it. And so I wrote it, and I sent a draft in to my editor, and she was like, God, do you really want to start the book this way? Everybody is going to put it down right away. But I think it's actually a really important thing, because it allows us, one, it's just an important thing. I surveyed 350 people using a Google form, you guys, about their history and practice, their first romantic experience, their first sexual experience, about what they heard from the church growing up. It was really open-ended, so you are the right people probably to ask for help analyzing my data. But I was really looking to just kind of hear people's stories. And one of my questions was, did you masturbate as a child? And then sort of, how did you understand it? And there were a few folks who were like, no, not interested. And no, certainly that would be a sin against my chastity. I can just imagine a 10-year-old telling you that. But then a whole bunch of people were like, yes, absolutely. I understood it as awesome. And then, and some others were like, yes, constantly. So that was refreshing. But so because there was such an overwhelming response to that particular question, it seemed like something that had to be lifted up. But also, self-love invites us to consider the topic of pleasure without asking about a partner or desire as something. It's just it's sort of a pure form of pleasure without complication. So I don't know if I only know this because of history classes and my particular interest in the topic, but once upon a time, masturbation was often referred to as onanism. Have anybody heard that term ever? Okay, right? And so, particularly in the Victorian era, you could read about, how engaging in onanism will give you hairy palms and turn you blind and acne and all sorts of terrible things. So I wanted to share with you the story of Onan, okay? So it appears in Genesis, so the first book of the Bible. Later on in it, So it goes like this. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again she conceived and bore a son whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Kezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death, as you do. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so like more than once, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. The end. So, several things to know about this passage. Judah has 2 sons, an older and a younger. They're both married, and the first one, whose wife is Tamar, dies, right? He was wicked, so he's dead now. But to be a woman in biblical culture without attachment to a man was a hugely problematic and dangerous thing, right? You didn't count at all. So if you had a son, great, you were sort of safe, and you had a place in society because you had to raise him so that he could have property and a life. So you mattered that way. Or you could have a husband. So Onan is encouraged not to marry Tamar, his sister-in-law, but rather to give her a son. And he enjoys her, but does not give her a son, and in fact actively prevents giving her a son in the only way that you could in biblical Israel. And so he, spills his seed, and this is displeasing to the Lord. So this is the story, then, of like male pleasure without conception that becomes sort of the doctrine of the church, that sex should be for procreation. This is the story that gets used to sort of talk about why that's so critical.
That sounds like it's very anti the rhythm method.
Right. Oh, yes. Well, because you're not supposed to use that. No. I mean, even good Catholics are not supposed to use the rhythm method. Not really. Because every occasion of sexual congress you should be open to children, right? Which is, man, I have 3 children. And that is a lot of work, right? You have children. They're a lot of work. So I can't quite imagine that. So nonetheless, here is a story then about a sexual relationship that has gone awry and has become sinful. It's not a mutual sexual relationship exactly. I mean, she's probably glad to, or in theory, to have the opportunity to have a son and then have a life and livelihood. But it doesn't actually seem like this is a story about self-love, right? Right? No, right? He has a partner, so like how to... Okay, but so in my read of the story then, Onan's real sin is that he is shirking his duty to his sister-in-law. He's having sex with her, and presumably enjoying it, without fulfilling his obligation, and actually then doing injury to her. The practice of marrying your sister-in-law, as I said, or giving your dead brother an heir, was a means of security and protection for a woman who would otherwise be without support. Onan has sex with Tamar, but denies her the means to protect or sustain herself. So here is, I think, the actual moral of this text, if you can sort of say that. Pursuing pleasure at a cost to another, especially a vulnerable other, is displeasing to the Lord. So shame on Onan. And I think it's important to think about these things. The church, as I say, that I grew up in, the only conversation, the very limited conversation that we had was like, sexuality is a good gift from God, right? We had all these nice, happy, healthy, like growing up books, and really there was sort of no discussion about what might count as like sexual sin. And so I think it's important to both affirm that, sexuality is not something dirty or shameful or horrible, but also to say that there are ways you can do it wrong, right? And not in terms of like who you're with, and not talking about positions or whatever. But like there are ways you can do it wrong, and one of them is by taking advantage of a vulnerable other. The rest of the book sort of goes through a number of these things, and I want to really just open ourselves up to questions fairly shortly. But I wanted to just sort of suggest to you that over the centuries, biblical texts have been interpreted in a number of ways, and they really always have been. I'm going to read to you sort of in closing in just a second, and as we then move into the time for questions, a piece of the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, which over time has been used to describe the sort of wonderful mutual loving relationship between God and Israel, the people Israel, or between Christ and the church, the sort of mutual connection and mystical union that is there. But if you've ever actually read the Song of Songs, you might take a different interpretation of it. There are two voices in it, and it moves back and forth. So the woman speaks in this excerpt first. I was sleeping, but my heart was awake. A sound. My love is knocking. He says, open for me, my sister, my dearest, my dove, my perfect one. My head is soaked with dew, my hair with the night mists. She says, I have taken off my tunic. Why should I put it on again? I have bathed my feet. Why should I get them dirty? My love put his hand in through the latch hole, and my body ached for him. I rose. I went to open for my love, and my hands dripped myrrh, my fingers liquid myrrh over the handles of the lock. I read that, and I don't exactly think of like Christ and the church. I don't know. So there's this erotic love poem here situated in the midst of the Bible. So part of my hope for the book is to affirm that desire and pleasure are important parts of what it means to be human, to seek to be in relationship, to know someone in a particularly intimate way can be a remarkably grace-filled experience. Grace, in one of the thinkers that I particularly love, is experiencing grace is like the feeling of knowing that you are accepted, right? And to be vulnerable with a partner and to feel seen and known and loved is like an experience of grace then, in my mind, to feel that acceptance, and can be a powerful then and holy thing. And so I think this is such a vital conversation. I don't think, to counter those who criticize me on my Facebook page, that everything always is good, right? Not every sexual thing, because it is done with our bodies, which are created by God, we say, is a good thing. There are, in fact, things that harm others. And I think that's one of the things that looking at some of the texts can suggest to us. It's not just about the sort of letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And part of sexual ethics then in the church, and I think for all people even outside of the church, is to think about what are the norms by which we determine what is good and what is holy and what is loving. One more. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is asked point blank the greatest of the commandments, right? There are hundreds of laws for the people Israel, and certainly like countless admonitions from the Apostle Paul and in the other letters. But in the Gospels, from the voice of Jesus, we hear that his reply to this question about what the greatest of commandments is: you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. So my hope in this book, in telling embarrassing stories about myself and saying words that make me blush in public, in writing something my kid can't read yet, she's super mad about that, my hope in this is to start to invite people to think about what a faithful sexual ethics looks like. Like, what are the things that help us in all our relationships to fulfill these commandments? How do you love God and yourself and your neighbor as best you can? So, thank you. Are there any questions?
One of the things I wonder about is the relationship between sex and marriage, and the fact that in a lot of different cultures over the years, they've been closely tied, and you can almost see marriage as coming from some sort of a societal stamp of approval on a sexual relationship, right? Or involvement in some way, right? And right now, that is. Marriage is almost like, a big ceremony and a legal proceeding, and it seems like it's disassociated from its original kind of stamp of approval on the sex, essentially. Do you see any role for the larger community in blessing a sexual relationship?
Like in marriage?
Like in marriage. Like the use of marriage for that is like... It's been disassociated with that. And is that appropriate? And if so, is there some other way to have the larger community involved?
So marriage is a funny thing, right? Because it has not been certainly the same thing in all times and places. I mean, yes, it was in some ways a stamp of approval saying, like, this is the person you get to have sex with, right? Like, and more often than not, like, this is the woman that you kind of like paid enough to get to have sex with. Hopefully she's interested too. So I think that like our sense of marriage as like a romantic partnering over time that then receives this blessing. I mean, that is in some ways a very modern invention. I like to think about love and sex and marriage as a Venn diagram, where they're each their own thing, but there is definitely a place where they all kind of come together. And I think that's a really wonderful thing when they can all come together. And I think there are certainly, I know why churches bless marriages, right? I mean, there is something amazing about, I always say I never liked the phrase like taking a leap of faith until I got married. Like I never understood what it was. I always thought it was like doing something dumb and hoping for the best. But in some ways that's like what getting married is, I mean, like you make this huge promise that you're going to live together with somebody and be with them and love them and be faithful to them for the most part, and I mean, many people, that's usually what people promise in their marriages. But, and you don't know if it's going to turn out or not. I mean, it's written right there in the vows that you're going to stay, even in sickness and in health and rich and poor. So I think that that's a wonderful and holy thing. So I don't want like the church to get out of the marriage business, but I think there's also the possibility for like holy and wonderful sexual relationships, like not in marriage. There's maybe this is more than you want to hear, but there's a theologian who talks about how like any sexual relationship that like you can see the end of is not like it's not holy. So like you want like so basically he's saying you have to be married, but you can't really know. I think. I mean you can't really know if a marriage is gonna end. Well, yeah. I mean you can't really know, and so to say that something isn't holy simply because you don't know how it's going to turn out years from now doesn't seem quite accurate either. So, I don't know. Does that kind of get at what you were wanting?
I just wanted to hear thoughts on the subject, so that was good. Thanks.
In this room, perhaps a year or so ago, an author spoke about her book about the real Amazons. And among the points she made were that when you had nomadic peoples before their society started cutting up pieces of land and declaring them owned by people, it was the relationship between the sexes was more equitable. But that movement to an agrarian society resulted in effectively ownership of women being important because you were contributing your land and your effort to feed the offspring which might not be yours. And so that in some way could be viewed as the origin of the need to have societal blessed unions. And also the taboo of sex outside that union because it undermined that structure of society. It seems to me we're moving in a direction where the needs of that no longer really apply. For the most part, we don't have all of the land cut up and occupied by the owner of the land who lives there raising, creating crops. So many people live in rented apartments. You can, move in with your mom if your relationship breaks up. There's a much more, it seems to me, a more fluid environment. And so I'm hopeful that we will over time transition from structural support for society functioning to more a bond between people, more holy union rather than, more matrimony rather than marriage,
Right.
You might say. Less about the finances and more about the part that matters, the love in the sense of caring rather than love in the sense of euphemism for sex.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, societies are going to organize themselves as they will, around any number of different things. I counsel a lot of people about getting married, right? Like, I meet with them a bunch of times and we plan their service and talk about what it means to be married. And I have, almost every wedding I've ever done, the couple has already lived together, right? So they certainly don't seem to care for my blessing about whether or not they're going to be having sex, which is cool. But one thing that we do always talk about, like, the details of, like, married life, that it's amazing how who's doing the dishes or not can, like, affect whether or not you feel like going to bed with them, at the end of the day. And so I do think that, like, I would much prefer people to marry because they desire to be committed to one another than because it is economically feasible. I think that, but I don't think that we can ever kind of, like, really divorce, the sort of, ephemeral and emotional commitments from the sort of day-to-day tasks of life together. When my husband and I bought our first house together, the, like, real estate lawyer is sitting there and he's just like, now, you have to both pay for this, even if, like, this doesn't work out. We're like, oh, gee, thanks, But, anyway. But honestly, I mean, once you have kids or you, like, have property or whatever, I mean, you may well have more, I don't like to speak in crass economic terms, but, like, you sort of have more incentive to work on it, because you can't just pick up and leave. Your lives are, like, enmeshed in certain ways. But yeah. But but the way that we think about relationships are different. And I think part of the important thing then for us going forward is not necessarily being wed to a particular structure or a particular institution as we've understood it in whatever historical period, but to ask, like, who does this render vulnerable? Marriage is good for raising children. Children need, like, some stability, and so not all marriages, but in general, stability is good for children. So, like, if we're going to move away from marriage, how else are we going to make sure that children are cared for and have what they need? So I think that those, but at the same time, I think that an emphasis on marriage, when marriage equality passed, like, we rejoiced, and and that was a wonderful thing. But there were also voices within the queer community that were like, we have a lot more pressing issues than, like, marriage. Thank you very much. Like, all the victories have not yet been won. And so I think that as we consider, as we continue in conversation, we have to keep track of how are vulnerable people, being affected by whatever changes we see.
My comment on moving away from the financial structure provided by the way marriage has been for probably millennia in some regard is that I feel like we need to divorce the financial contract from that was not an intentional pun, sorry. The financial contract from the union of two people who care for each other in that way, in that intimate way, because I grew up with what I consider a relatively traditional family environment, where we had multiple generations living together, a brother and sister who just inherited the house that they grew up in and continued to live in it. The one who had the better salary kept working, and the other one took care of stuff at home. But the law would not allow them to pool their income and file for taxes together. There was no possible way they could, because they were siblings, even if they were to pretend. And so we have financial contracts that are tied to traditional relationships, regardless of whether the contract really has any need for that. And people who are bound by the expectation of a married couple with children, even if they've never had children. And so it seems to me that by having the birth of a child or a mortgage, you have stepped into the structure that is necessary to support that. While you were still single, the living together situation we have now, society sees that you're living together. Your friends know that you're living together. If one of you goes out with someone else, your friends are all going to look at you askance and ask what's going on here. So we have that not fully married concept socially. We just don't have it legally.
So I have another degree in public policy too, and so we do organizational theory and things like that. And one of the things that they just sort of emphasize is, like, institutions are doing what they're supposed to do. Like, they're inherently conservative, right? They're supposed to sort of keep things the same over time, and so helping institutions which are inherently conservative to adapt to social changes is ongoing work, right? And doesn't happen very quickly.
So you mentioned that the current view is relatively recent, and there's a whole different spread of ages here. So my entire life, as far as I've been able to tell, the dominant Christian viewpoint has been, abstinence only, this is bad, and so on. So how do you think that can? To say be changed sounds like going in and, like, forcing other people to believe something else, which isn't good either. But I mean, besides, I guess, writing a book that might perhaps appeal to
That's what I'm going to do. What are you going to do?
Right. Yeah. How would you suggest going about? Right. As you've seen on your Facebook page, you've mentioned lots of people, like, take offense to what you're saying. So yes, how do you think we can help, like, spread it into the country and even beyond the country?
In the church, for example, in trying to shift the way that we talk about sexuality, we, for the last generation, in the mainline church, we've talked about rights language, and we've talked about justice, and I think that's critically important. I mean, like, you don't do ethics without a concern for justice, right? That's not very good ethics. But I think that you change hearts and minds by building bridges and inviting conversation and asking people to reflect on their experiences. And in the first church that I served, it was a super tiny congregation with, like, basically little old ladies, and our town was increasingly home to this, like the town had, the Chamber of Commerce had specifically started encouraging members of the queer community to like move to it because they had like great affordable bungalows and it was close to the city and it was great. And so for like this reason, like, you know, we have this growing population, we should have this conversation about sexuality. And to see if we could make a sort of public statement about whether or not they would be welcome here in this congregation. And so we started having this conversation, me and like all the old ladies. And in some ways, you know, it was just such a surprising thing. We started having a conversation, and this one woman, Liz, who may or may not yet be living, but she said, you know, when I got married, I married a Catholic. And the priest wouldn't marry us because, you know, it was just outside of the practice of, you know. And she was like, it's the same thing. I mean, in her mind, like, her experience of being turned away from the church because of who she was, you know, it was totally analogous. And so I think by asking, I mean, it's like a little different, but like, you know, but I think encouraging people to think about their experiences and how they might be similar to other people's experiences, I think can be a way of doing that. And then, you know, for the church, I think, you know, we have to do the sort of nitty-gritty work of like looking at the text and reflecting on our theology and making the case that, you know, that there's an alternative, that there's not only one Christian way of talking about this.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, thank you.